Well, hello everyone. This is Matt McKnight, Chief Archaeologist with the Maryland Historical Trust. I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy during the current COVID-19 crisis and practicing social distancing. Of course, April is Maryland Archaeology Month. It just sort of is unfortunate that this year it's overlapped with this pandemic. And in order to protect the public, events celebrating Archaeology Month around the state have had to be canceled. And typically those events include lab opportunities, lectures, exhibits, archaeology days, a lot of things that we just can't really do this year. So in an effort to try and provide a kind of virtual Archaeology Month experience, the MHT Office of Archaeology is going to try a little experiment here. And as chief of the office, I, of course, get to be the guinea pig. So today I'm going to be offering a kind of online lecture. So bear with me. Hopefully this technology all works out without too many glitches, and hopefully you all enjoy it. So okay, so hopefully you can all see the screen there. And this talk that I'm giving is really an adaptation of a talk that I was planning to give both at an Archaeology Month event in Frederick that's now been canceled, as well as at the annual meeting of the Society for American Archaeology, which was going to be held in Austin, Texas. That's also been canceled. Though at the SAA event, this would have been a much shorter, in a much shorter form. The talk is on some previously unpublished information about a contact period component at the Biggs Ford site in Frederick County that was discovered during a collaborative effort by the American University, Towson University, the Maryland Historical Trust, and the Archaeological Society of Maryland. And it was uncovered during the annual Tyler Bastian field sessions from 2013 to 2015. And I'll talk a little bit more later about that collaboration. Now, when archaeologists talk about contact sites, what we're really talking about are Native American sites which bear evidence of contact, trade, and interaction with European peoples. Now, in Maryland, we are usually talking about the English and the period anywhere from the early 17th century to the mid or even the late 18th century, depending on what part of Maryland you're talking about. So in Southern Maryland and on the Eastern Shore, those dates tend to be earlier, starting around 1630. And in Western Maryland, the period of contact lasts much later, as most Native American peoples are being displaced and moving further and further out from the ever-expanding English colony. So it's kind of a moving target. So we'll get into the artifact types that indicate Native American contact with Europeans soon. But before I get into that, I need to give a little bit of background on the site. So the Biggs Ford site is situated along Glade Creek in the Monocacy Valley. It's the geology of the site is it's basically dark floodplain topsoil over a very distinct clay subsoil. It was first professionally excavated in 1969 and 1970 by the Maryland Geological Survey Division of Archaeology, or the MGS, working with the newly formed Archaeological Society of Maryland Incorporated, or the ASM. So the excavations in 1969 and 1970 were carried out as a salvage archaeology undertaking. The sort of fruit of that, or the offspring of that, is what we today call the annual field session in Maryland Archaeology, the Tyler Bastian field session. So here's the part of the talk where I put in my obligatory plug for the annual Tyler Bastian field session. The field session is held for 10 consecutive days, generally from the first Friday before Memorial Day until the first Monday in June. We're currently working to figure out what's going to happen with the current situation. But that is currently the dates that we have scheduled for it this year. Will be at the Billingsley site in Prince George's County. It's open to members of the ASM and members of the public alike. But to join the ASM, it's a society of both professional and avocational archaeologists that's dedicated to preserving, investigating, and documenting Maryland's prehistoric and historic cultural resources. It only costs $25 a year to join, and it includes a monthly newsletter and a semi-annual journal, Maryland Archaeology, which I'm the editor of. The ASM sponsors workshops throughout the year, symposia, chapter meetings held throughout the state, and then the 10-day annual field session where we work usually with an outside partner to train the general public who attends in proper archaeological field techniques and excavation and documentation. And it's a blast. It's the highlight of mine, and I think most of the archaeology staff's year. So the 1969 and 70 excavations were kind of a salvage operation. The nearby town of Walkersville, Maryland, was being connected up to the Frederick City sewer system. And Maryland's first state archaeologist, Tyler Bastion, was contacted by the property owners and some local collectors who notified him of the threat to the site that was going to be created by this sewer line being installed. So data recovery excavations were subsequently conducted by the Maryland Geological Survey Division of Archaeology and the ASM. The MGS Division of Archaeology was later absorbed into the Maryland Historical Trust in 1990, and that's the agency that I work for. Excavations commenced following the removal of topsoil within the sewer line right-of-way. They used a tractor that was fitted with some grading equipment to expose the subsoil, and the features were then cleaned up by Tyler and the ASM. Now, what a feature is, that's basically a hearth. It could be a human burial. It could be a soil stain, post molds. You can really think of these as almost like artifacts that can't be removed from the site. They have to be mapped in order to be documented. You can't pick them up and take them away the way an artifact can be. And this is one of the reasons archaeologists can get kind of hot under the collar about certain metal detectors and artifact collectors who remove artifacts from a site without doing the associated mapping, without mapping the features. It really destroys the context of sites, and so we can get a lot less useful information out of them because of that. Setting that aside, Tyler and the ASM, they worked at the site from October of 1969 to July of 1970, and here we see some photographs showing the grading equipment clearing off the trench, as well as the field crew then working in the footprint left behind by that grading equipment. So this is what they found. They were uncovering primarily the evidence of 2 late woodland occupations at the site. That's what was exposed. They did find some earlier stuff, to be sure. Earlier prehistoric stuff, but the major finding was that there were 2 really well-preserved late woodland communities that had occupied this site. The first was a circa AD 1000 to 1450 Montgomery Complex hamlet. That was about a 25-meter wide circular village. That's projected out, the 25 meters is projected out from the series of elongated pits associated with the Montgomery Complex. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then overlapping with that was a circa AD 1300 to 1500 Loray Focus or Kaiser palisaded village. So what do we mean by Montgomery Focus and our Montgomery Complex and Kaiser Focus? Well, the Montgomery Complex, again, dates from about the year 1000 to 1400. A typical type of pottery that's found with it is shepherdware, which is a crushed rock tempered and collared ceramic, which dates from about AD 900 to 1450. They were using triangular projectile points, small triangular projectile points during this time period. And their villages tended to be sort of small sedentary hamlets, often circular and arranged around a series of elongated subterranean pits. They are known from the dietary data that's been found that they were practicing mixed agriculture and hunting-gathering economy. The elongated subterranean pits are situated outside of houses, and that combined with the burial techniques that are observed on these sites. These are usually single flexed burials, individuals buried in sort of a fetal position without many associated funerary objects. So the lack of funerary objects and the elongated subterranean pits that aren't controlled by a single household and are instead sort of communal suggests very egalitarian social organization in these societies. By contrast, the Loray Focus, which dates from about AD 1300 to 1600, is characterized by Kaiserware, which is a crushed shell-tempered ceramic. If you look at the cross-section ceramic sherd image at the bottom of the bottom right hand of the slide, you can kind of see the linear shape of the shell, the crushed mussel shell that's been incorporated into the pottery. So that's the type of pottery that they're using, as opposed to the crushed rock-tempered pottery used in the Montgomery Complex. They're still using triangular projectile points. The bow and arrow had come into North America by then, and it didn't ever really leave. They're living in much larger palisaded and sedentary villages. They're usually circular, and sometimes there's kind of an open area in the center of the village that sort of serves as a plaza. Agriculture is really more the mainstay of the economy, supplemented with hunting and gathering. So they're becoming more reliant on corn, squash, and beans, and supplementing that with hunting and gathering. Burials tend to be extended with associated funerary objects, and so that combined with smaller subterranean storage pits located within houses suggests a much more hierarchical or unequal social organization. So that was really the state of our knowledge prior to about 2009 about the site. When in 2009, Charlie Hall, the state terrestrial archaeologist here at MHT, got a call from the owners of the property, letting us know that the field in which the site's located was about to be plowed for the first time in many, many years, and wanting to know if we would like to come out and conduct a surface collection. So Charlie roped me, some other MHT archaeologists, and Professor Joe Dent of American University into coming out to conduct a surface collection to see if we could determine from the distribution of artifacts how large the villages had been. And based on the results of that surface collection work and some subsequent conversations with the property owners, we ultimately decided to return to the Biggs Ford site for more detailed excavation in 2013 for the annual Tyler Bastion field session. And we would then not leave for another couple years. We were there for field sessions from 2013 to 2015. So now the goal of that field session was to test the spatial hypothesis to see if the Montgomery and Kaiser villages, the things marked here in red for Montgomery and the green for the Kaiser village, did those in fact extend out into the areas where we expected them to? That's the circles there, projecting out the circles from Tyler's Trench. So based on our surface collection data, as well as projecting that out, were the villages indeed that large, or the size that we expected them to be? Were they placed where we thought they should be? So in 2013, the state's Office of Archaeology, along with the ASM, our partners at American University and Towson University, we made our triumphant return to Biggs Ford, and we were going to stay for the next 2 consecutive field sessions. And we did record a lot of new data related to the late woodland and other prehistoric occupations at the site, as we expected. The team encountered nearly 50 features, 305 post molds, and thousands upon thousands of artifacts. What we did not uncover any recognizably historic features, but we did uncover historic period artifacts. So of the nearly 123,000 artifacts cataloged from the 2013 to 2015 field sessions, only 302 appear to be historic, and most of these can probably be interpreted as field scatter associated with the historic occupation of the property owner's house, which has been more or less continuously occupied since around 1818. And here are some images of some of the things that we found. Largely, again, what we expected to find, but within that historic collection of 302 objects, we did eventually find some things that we weren't expecting to see at the site. You just get through these last few photographs showing, so there's some of the post molds and folks working at the site. So we did find some things that we weren't expecting to find in that historic collection. So this is a glass trade bead. We know that this object came into the Monocacy Valley through trade and contact with Europeans, as there was no glass in North America aside from naturally occurring volcanic glass called obsidian prior to its arrival through trade. In this case, trade with the English. And ultimately, we found 9 of these glass beads. 8 were black glass, and 1 is what's called a cornalline d'Aleppo bead. That's a red glass outer surface with a green core. And for comparison's sake, I show here a few of the very same bead forms, and you'll notice this from the rest of the slides. I put the comparison sites to the right and what we found at Biggs Ford on the left. So these are some of these same bead forms recovered from the late 17th century Piscataway Fort in Zacchaeus Swamp, excavated by St. Mary's College of Maryland, and also from the early 18th century Piscataway Fort on Heater's Island. So these glass beads were found in much greater quantities at those 2 sites, with 289 recovered from Zacchaeus Fort and 402 from Heater's Island. These images are just showing a sample here. Dennis Curry reports that the cornalline d'Aleppo, followed by the opaque black, make up the bulk of the glass bead collection from Heater's Island. And at Biggs Ford, we see the same forms present. Unlike both Heater's Island and Zacchaeus Fort, we recovered no seed beads. Those are the little tiny beads that you see up there on the Heater's Island portion of the slide, the little tiny ones. This could very well be due to our sampling methods. So we were screening through 1/4-inch hardware mesh, and all of the beads were recovered from the plow zone and not from feature contexts, which would have been subject to an additional process, which we call flotation, where we pass soil samples through a process of water filtration, where it allows smaller artifacts to be discovered. In this case, since the feature contexts weren't or the only ones that were floated, the small seed beads would have just passed through the 1/4-inch mesh and would have not been recovered. So this slide shows the distribution of those beads throughout the site. And you'll notice that they all came from the central block. So we excavated in 3 areas when we were there from 2013 to 2015. There's a few test units situated to the south of the site. There are, that's down here. There are there's a large block of test units up to the north, and then we have this central block where all the contact area components seem to come out. So it wasn't just the glass beads that were recovered there. We found several other objects of interest, and I'll get to those in a minute. But I just want to point out that it was mostly coming from the central part of the site. And when we first found these things, I think it was universally sort of thought that it must be the Piscataway who brought these objects here. And that sort of makes sense. Heater's Island is not very far away. Heater's Island is the principal village of the Piscataway or Kanoi peoples. It was their principal village from about 1699 to at least 1704 and possibly as late as 1712. That site was excavated by the University of Maryland in the summer of 1970, but unfortunately the research was never published. We hope to, in the near future, publish a manuscript on the Heater's Island excavations by MHT Press. The square village, it was a square village with a wooden stockade and bastions. It was visited several times by rangers from the Maryland militia, and of course, again, it was excavated, so we know a good bit about the structure of the fort and who lived there and the types of artifacts that they recovered. And we're seeing some of the same artifact types recovered at Biggs Ford. Now, I think we have a tendency in Maryland archaeology sometimes to think of the Piscataway as the Maryland Indian tribe. And to be sure, they were the principal tribe controlling the Western Shore when the first English settlers began arriving here in the 17th century. But there were other unallied groups who were present and very active. In particular, there are the Shawnee at the head of the bay in the late 17th century, documented, and later they're also out in Western Maryland. And then likewise, the Susquehannock can be documented archaeologically. They can be documented archaeologically out in Western Maryland, and they're documented in the colonial records in Northern Maryland as well. But the Piscataway are definitely a good bet based on the types of artifacts that we found. So here are some of the other types of artifacts we found. We found 2 brass projectile points and some pieces of brass scrap. When these brass points are found at Native American archaeological sites in Maryland, they're typically found to date to the mid to late 17th to early 18th century. And unlike the glass beads, which are being manufactured in Europe and appearing in the archaeological site, more or less unaltered from their manufactured form, the brass points are a European metal that's been shaped and altered to native uses. So Indian traders aren't trading brass points out to, when I say Indian traders, I mean white European traders who are trading with the Indians. They are trading brass and copper alloy pots and kettles out to the indigenous groups, and they're then being reshaped by native peoples into these forms. So they are kind of a telltale sign of native occupation. One of the points is pierced for hafting, and both are very typical of what are in collections from elsewhere within the state. Along the right-hand side of the slide, again, are some examples from other sites: Heater's Island, Zakiah Fort, and the Posey site. The 2 pieces of scrap that we found at Biggs Fort are very similar in thickness to the points, and they may actually be fragments of points, particularly the piece of scrap shown to the right, which is pierced, similar to the way the points frequently are. Now, some archaeologists seem to be sort of reluctant to refer to these as points. I'm not one of those archaeologists. People suggest that they could have been used for ornamentation, and I don't discount that they may have been used for that function at times. And they do make a good argument. These objects are rather flimsy. However, there is some really good evidence that they were being used as projectile points. First, we have ethnohistoric accounts, and here are just 2 examples from the Pequot War up in Connecticut, but I have actually found a handful of other accounts. Captain John Underhill first relates during the Pequot War between the English and the Mohican and other Indian groups in Connecticut with the Pequot Indians who were allied to the Dutch. Underhill relates that the Pequot Indians were fashioning trade kettles into arrowheads in that period, 1636 to 1637. And he's asking traders not to trade with the Indians because they're going to turn these kettles into weapons of war that could be used against them in the future. Captain John Mason, he relates during the siege of the Mystic Fort in Connecticut that a gentleman named Lieutenant Seeley was shot in the eyebrow, which bent a flat point, most likely brass. It bent the point inward. It had to have been metal because it bent. And it's probably a thin metal like these brass points were. It bent it inward when it hit the man's skull. So he survived, but it got recorded in the ethnohistoric record. We also have numerous hafted archaeological specimens from dry cave environments and burials recovered in Pennsylvania and New York. And then, if that wasn't enough, there is one example from Massachusetts of a brass point that was actually embedded in the lumbar vertebra of a Native American burial. So, barring the most unfortunate wardrobe malfunction imaginable, these things were used as points. So we have some nails recovered from the site. One is pretty clearly a hand-wrought rosehead nail. Another example looks like it is probably hand-wrought, but it's tough to really say as the head portion of the nail is missing. We recovered 18 white clay tobacco pipe fragments, 5 bowls, and 13 stems. The bowl fragments are plain and entirely non-diagnostic, but most of the stems seem to fit a late 17th or early 18th century chronology based on the width of their bore diameters. Those stems are shown here on the left and are sorted by their bore diameters. With only 13 stems available, the site hasn't really produced anywhere near the size sample that's needed to produce a mean date for the occupation. So we can't date the site or the contact period component of the site, at least, using this method. There just isn't a large enough sample to be statistically significant. But simply applying Harrington's original 1954 histogram model, which shows that bore diameters tend to get narrower and narrower over time, a pretty interesting pattern emerges spatially. What we see is all of the wider bored pipes, the ones we typically think of as earlier, they show up only in the central block where the glass beads and the brass points came from. The narrow bored pipe stems, by contrast, they show up in the central block and also closer to Glade Creek, which not only floods periodically, and may have deposited some of them there, but on the opposite side of the creek and just downstream is where the earliest English occupation of the land is known to have taken place, no earlier than 1737. So with decreasing distance to that area of the earliest historic occupation or European occupation, you see more of the later pipe types being encountered. The rest of the historic assemblage from Biggs Ford can largely be assigned to much later time periods, specifically the 19th and 20th century occupations that are associated with the nearby farmhouse of the property owners. But there were a handful of items that did fall into a sort of a maybe category, things that may be altogether unrelated to the contact period occupation, which we can't really rule out either. Those included this iron ring found in the central block, which is about the right size to be a bradoon bit, which is a piece of horse tack. We have a higher caliber lead ball and a piece of burnt and patinated bottle glass. If there was evidence of chippage on the bottle glass, flaking like it had been knapped or worked like a stone tool, then we could tie this pretty definitively to the contact component, but unfortunately, we don't have any such markings. So just like we have potentially later objects that we can't definitively tie to the contact component, we also have earlier objects that we can't definitively tie to it. Most notably, we have a number of indigenous pipes. Not too surprisingly, considering the site's major late woodland occupations, the pipes fall both within and outside the central block. We have a stone pipe fragment as well as a pipe with a shepherdware-like paste, both of which were recovered in the vicinity of the Montgomery Complex village, that area to the south. But the pipes of real interest with relation to the contact period component are those found in the northern and central blocks. And we have 11 pipes exhibiting either a Kaiser-like shell-tempered paste with large plate-like inclusions where the shells eroded out, or a sandy Potomac Creek-like paste. And these are the types of ceramic that we would expect on a contact period site. So these are just a few pulled examples shown here in this image here. There's no real horizontal or vertical patterning and no definitive way to say that these were late woodland pipes or they were contact period pipes. But we would certainly expect to see native-made pipes of these forms on a 17th or early 18th century Native American site. So now we get to the really interesting question, which is who were the occupants of this site during this contact period, and what type of occupation was it? And first off, I want to point out again to the fact that it's a very spatially discrete assemblage of artifacts. In this slide, you can see the distribution of all 302 historic artifacts on the landscape of the site. So it's basically everything that is not prehistoric. And you can see things are spread out pretty evenly across the site. There's, those 302 objects are spread all over the place in all the different areas where we were working. By contrast, here you can see the distribution of just those objects that I feel confident we can tie to the contact period occupation. Again, notice they are situated only in that central block. And these items include the glass beads, the brass points and scrap, the wider board pipe stems, and the one rosehead nail. So it's a very compact arrangement of artifacts compared to the much more widespread distribution of both the earlier and later finds. So in order to examine the material culture represented at Biggs Ford and to kind of begin to take a stab at what may be going on here during the contact period, I found it informative to kind of compare the collection to those of contemporary sites in the region. I'm going to focus on Native American occupation or settlement contexts here and ignore ossuaries, colonial outposts, and other site types where European trade goods are sometimes found. I've picked instead Native American residential sites. I've picked 4 well-documented sites for comparison, beginning with the Posey site. The Posey site's on the north shore of Mattawoman Creek in Charles County. The site dates from AD 1650 to 1700, and it represents a secluded Mattawoman Indian household that may also have served as a kind of trading post. Then there's the Camden site, which is believed to be the principal residence of the chief of the Machatic Indians. It is situated on the south side of the Rappahannock River in Caroline County, Virginia. And it is the site of one cabin within a dispersed Native American village that the Virginia legislature had established as a kind of early reservation during the 17th century. The site dates from 1650 to 1690. Then there's Zekiah Fort, which was the fortified capital of the Piscataway Indian Nation on the western side of Zekiah Swamp in Charles County, Maryland. This site is very tightly dated from about 1680 to 1692 based on historical accounts. And it was constructed by the colonists to provide assistance. The fort at Zekiah was constructed by the colonists to provide assistance to the Piscataway, who were under constant attack from the Susquehannock and other tribes to the north. And finally, there's Heater's Island, which I've already mentioned, which was the home of that same community of Indians at Zekiah, many likely the same individuals, just 7 years later. So the site, Heater's Island, dates from 1699 to at least 1704, and possibly as late as, excuse me, possibly as late as 1712. It is situated on an island in the Potomac River near Point of Rocks, and just north of the confluence with the Monocacy. And as a side note, Biggs Ford is roughly 32-mile canoe trip upriver from Heaters Island. So this table, though not exhaustive, it catalogs a lot of the artifact forms found in common on both on these different sites. So to compile this, I made use of a number of resources, including the totally awesome Colonial Encounters database. If you're interested in having a look, just Google Colonial Encounters. I'm pretty sure it'll be your first hit. So we looked at that database, looked at the original site reports, and also Dennis Curry's unpublished draft report on the Heaters Island excavations. The first really obvious conclusion when looking at this table is that the collection from Biggs Ford is quite limited, both in quantity and the variety of objects found. During the 2013 to 2015 excavations, we only recovered one sherd of verifiable colonial pottery, and that's actually a creamware sherd. So technically it's colonial, but really it's late colonial. So I include it here because it fits the definition, but it's really not pertinent to the discussion. We have the one possible piece of colonial bottle glass highlighted here in red because it's a possible contact period artifact. And it doesn't have any evidence of flaking on it, so we don't have no flaked glass or glass worked into points. While Biggs Ford does have metallic points, again, these are less impressive than at the other sites in both quantity and variety. We have no iron points and no cone-shaped forms, which are sometimes found. We have none of those at Biggs Ford. Those are the totals shown in parentheses. We have no gun parts identified and only one piece of lead shot. Again, indigenous pipes are tallied in red because we can't easily discern late woodland specimens from the contact specimens. And a good number of colonial pipe fragments are present, but some are late and some are non-diagnostic bowl specimens. Beads are one of the exceptions where we actually found more than two of the comparison sites. But we see, again, less variety, no seed beads, and that could be related to sampling. And only 2 wrought nails were encountered, and only one of those we're really certain about. So what kind of conclusions can we reach? Well, unfortunately, not much without further work. But I think it is interesting that the collection that seems to compare the best is the Camden site, which is a single cabin within a larger complex. However, the lack of colonial earthenware, the presence of only one possible piece of colonial bottle glass at Biggs Ford, the lack of wrought nails, all these kind of point to a more ephemeral occupation than a cabin. Perhaps maybe we're even just talking about a short-lived campsite. Now, about a year ago, in doing some of the background research for a chapter I'm putting together on this very topic for the final Biggs Ford report, so long after we left the site in 2015, I came across a historic account, an account that really completely changed my view of which Native American group may have occupied the Biggs Ford site and of what the Monocacy Valley was really like in this period of transition from indigenous control to English settlement. And I didn't find it in the archives of Maryland. Instead, I found it in the archives of Pennsylvania. And that is the story of Samantane and the Cartledge brothers. So now I'm going to apologize up front. I don't actually know how this individual's name was pronounced. It's an Iroquoian name, recorded as written down by an 18th century English pen. So knowing just how any of the names mentioned in this very much true story is difficult, but I'm going to push forward nonetheless. So Samantane was a Seneca Indian who was living somewhere in the Monocacy Valley in an isolated cabin with his wife in 1721. He was killed by John and Edmund Cartledge, 2 brothers, both white fur traders out of Philadelphia. Now, at the time, Maryland and Pennsylvania were still disputing where the boundaries of their respective territories ended and began. And in addition, the Pennsylvanians had made allies of the Susquehannock or Conestoga peoples, who were greatly disturbed once word reached them of this man's murder. Fearing that the powerful Five Nations Iroquois to the north, to which Samantane, as a Seneca Indian, he belonged to the Seneca clans there, and the English in Pennsylvania were actually pretty concerned that this could touch off violence on the frontier if they didn't intervene. So they immediately arrested the Cartledge brothers, and they sent envoys to the Iroquois and set about undertaking a kind of investigation of the killing. And it makes for really interesting reading, as the English actually took detailed deposition from several Indian witnesses, from individuals, including some eyewitnesses to the murder, such as Wayne Prietna, the Shawnee wife of the victim, a Piscataway or Kanoi Indian guide to the Cartledge brothers who was present, two Shawnee Indian travelers, and William Wilkins and Jonathan, servants or slaves of John Cartledge. There are also material witnesses who observed the body after the fact. Those include a Susquehannock woman who performed the burial rite, an individual known simply as the hermaphrodite in the records. This was likely a Susquehannock or Conestoga Burdash or two-spirit individual, someone who didn't fit the English idea of gender norms, and who also performed the burial rite for Samantane. And also a Cayuga warrior who entered Samantane's cabin after the murder and observed the body. So the accounts establish that the murder occurred in the Monocacy Valley at an isolated cabin inhabited only by Samantane and his Shawnee wife, and described as being in an uninhabited wilderness 3 days' journey from Conestoga. Conestoga was the principal village of the Susquehannocks in what was then Chester County, Pennsylvania, now York County. Now the Cartledge brothers contended that the killing was in self-defense after a brawl broke out over the trading of rum. And this argument is sort of corroborated to some extent in the witness testimonies. However, it would appear that once the immediate threat was neutralized by taking away Samantane's gun and hitting him with it, that John Cartledge then proceeded to beat the Indian so severely, even as he lay on the ground, that he ultimately fractured his skull. The Cartledge brothers immediately left the scene, but Samantane's widow slowly made her way to Conestoga to report the crime. And in her absence, a Cayuga Indian had discovered the body in the abandoned cabin and then had hired two Susquehannock people out of Conestoga that he had met along the path between Conestoga and the Monocacy Valley. So he hired them to conduct the burial rites. One was a woman, and the other was this two-spirit individual. This sort of suggests that perhaps this type of work could not be performed by a Cayuga man. So I want to read just the account given by Samantane's wife, Wayne Prietna. I again apologize for the pronunciation, but I think her testimony is it's in line with most of the other Indian witnesses who testified, and I think it's pretty moving testimony. So the account reads, Ween Prietna, the squaw, was then examined and said that she was in the cabin when her husband came in for the gun, that she shrieked out and endeavored to hinder him from carrying it out, but she could not. That she followed him, and Wilkins, one of the servants, being then by the cabin, laid hold of the gun, but could not take it from him. That Edmund forced it out of his hands, Edmund Cartledge, and struck him first on the shoulder and then thrice upon the head and broke the gun with the blows. That John Cartledge then stripped off his clothes and coming up to them found the Indian sitting, and he then gave him one kick on the side with his foot and then struck him with his fists. That the man never spake after that, receiving the blows, save that after he got into the cabin, he said his friends had killed him, that a great quantity of blood came from his wounds, which clotted over on the bear skin on which he lay, that his mouth and nose were all full of blood, and that he died the very next day, about the same time that he was wounded the day before. That she was alone with the corpse and went to seek some help to bury him, that in the meantime an Indian woman, the wife of Piscataway of Conestoga, along with the hermaphrodite of that same place, coming there by accident, and finding the man dead, buried him in the cabin, and were gone from there before she returned. But she met them along the way, and understood by them that they had laid him in the ground. So John Cartledge and his brother Edmund would be held by the county sheriff for most of March 1721, but they were eventually released on bail. However, John Cartledge's name was ordered stricken from the Chester County rolls as a justice, and he was banned from crossing the Susquehanna to deal with the Indians. Eventually, the Five Nations Iroquois would send notice to the governor of Pennsylvania stating that it was their wish that John Cartledge may not be put to death for it, nor that the governor should be angry and should spare him for some time and put him to death afterwards. One life is enough, they said, to be lost. There should not be two that die. And that appears to have been the end of the affair. It's at least the last time we have any sort of recordation of it. So why do I bring up this story in association with this site? Well, it establishes several important facts. First, the account mentions that it would be impracticable to find a sufficient number of Christians, and by Christians they mean white people, willing to make the journey to the Monocacy in order to investigate the scene of the crime and constitute a jury. So this confirms that the Monocacy Valley was still largely unsettled by Europeans in 1721. White fur traders, though not settled there, were active along the Monocacy by at least the first decades of the 18th century. That's actually corroborated by other resources that point to French traders, to the English, to some German people of German descent moving through the area and trading with the Indians, but being sort of mobile and not settling down in that area. Some Native Americans, such as Samantane and his wife, were clearly living in isolated cabins or wigwams rather than in large villages. So maybe this isn't such a huge revelation, but the idea of an isolated cabin is a pretty close match, again, based on the comparative data that I spoke about earlier, for the type of occupation that we might be seeing at Biggs Ford. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, members of several Native groups were moving with regularity throughout the Monocacy Valley by 1721. We have the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Susquehannock, Piscataway, and Shawnee. All these different groups involved in the depositions here and moving through this landscape, some arriving on the scene of the crime purely by chance, it seems like. So that final point was really hammered home for me by a notation on a map drawn of the Potomac, also from 1721. And that's the Philemon Lloyd map titled Potomac Above Ye Inhabitants. This depicts yet another Native group present at the mouth of the Monocacy in that same year, 1721. Hopefully you'll be able to see this, make this out on your screens at home. But the map bears the notation Tuscarora Indian Town, and it depicts 3 cabins where the Monocacy flows into the Potomac. The Tuscarora, it turns out, had recently become refugees. The tribe had been decimated during the Tuscarora Wars in North Carolina between 1711 and 1715. And they finally signed a treaty with the English to end hostilities in 1718. Most of the tribe then began slowly migrating north, and this to join the Five Nations Iroquois, which afterwards were known as the Six Nations. This process took several decades, and it appears that a sojourn in Maryland was a part of that migration for at least some of the Tuscarora. The small creek that empties into the Potomac near the village site and just to the west of the Monocacy still bears that name. No Tuscarora village was recorded in this location when Robert Brooke carried out the first detailed survey of the mid-Potomac in 1737, though Heater's Island is recorded as Conoy Island with the notation once an Indian plantation. So here we have yet another indigenous tribal group present in the Monocacy Valley. So, all those groups I mentioned before, Cayuga, Seneca, Shawnee, Susquehannock, Conoy or Piscataway, and here the Tuscarora as well. So there's a lot of native groups moving through that area. So as to the question of who inhabited the Biggs Ford site, who knows? Recall that I originally mentioned feeling that surely it was the Piscataway from nearby Heater's Island that were visiting the site. I found out that, once you really start to delve deeply enough into the archival record, the water gets much murkier. The historic record reveals that the Monocacy Valley around the turn of the 18th century was really this very dynamic landscape that's inhabited by multiple native groups. It's frequented by European traders of diverse backgrounds. And this is also a disputed frontier territory that's claimed by both the Maryland and the Pennsylvania English. So it's that's the takeaway message from this. It's this dynamic landscape. And here we have a small piece of that represented at the Biggs Ford site. It's a really surprisingly diverse place. And even though we don't know yet precisely which Native American group can be tied to Biggs Ford, I'm glad that MHT, Archaeology, the ASM, and our partners were able to document their presence on the landscape. Clearly, Biggs Ford was a place that persisted in the minds of Native peoples, and I hope someday we are able to return to the site and learn a little bit more about this unexpected discovery. So with that, I feel like I have talked enough, and this is the part of the talk where I would normally open this up to questions, but since this is a virtual lecture, I appear to be off the hook. I hope you've enjoyed my talk, and I want to wish everyone a happy and hopefully a very healthy Maryland Archaeology Month. Cheers.